George. It is great to see you after so many years. It is almost 30 years. It is very long period, from 1996 until 2023. We have today different judgments what happened during all these decades. Secretary Blinken said that we face now destruction and end of post-Cold World order. Secretary Kissinger is saying that now we see the biggest threat to the existent world order. What you would say?
Well, I've never been sure what the world order means. The world has always been disorderly, and there's always been the fear that it will collapse, and it doesn't. What we're undertaking is a systematic shift in the way the global system operates. Whenever that happens, the stronger powers are afraid that their power will decline. Usually that doesn't happen. But we really have to understand what happened, is it the changes that are happening, the conquests, but more, the certainties that we lived by of what was going to happen. Well, those were wrong. The order is still there, but they still have it wrong.
We all now see two big events, let's say. One is Ukraine and Russian war, and beginning of the Middle East troubles.
Well, I would argue that the biggest issue is neither of those. The biggest issue is China. China, after Deng Xiaoping took office, was a flourishing place. Was surpassing the world. Now it is in economic turmoil. It's in a political turmoil with the disappearance of ministers and so on, and tensions between the interior of China and the coastal area. So the thing to understand is, okay, so what really matters? Well, whatever happens in the Ukrainian war, it will not pivot the world. Another Israeli war with the Arabs is not going to change anything. But China, and the expectations we had of China, which I think were vastly overstated, that does make a great deal of difference in how the world works, because everybody looked at China as the place where they could go next for capital, for trade, and so on. And that's not turning out that way.
Do you think that alliance between China and Russia could be sustainable?
You can sustain any alliance. The question is, what does China have to offer Russia that it needs, and what does Russia have to offer China? What China needs is export markets to be able to sell their goods at, and capital investment. Russia can't really give that. On the other hand, what Russia needs is men and weapons and so on. And China's a long way from Russia, but more to the point, it is not a risk they can afford to take at a time of great trouble. So this alliance is something we talk about a great deal because they're two great powers, it would seem. But in fact, one cannot help the other. Each needs something different, and the other one doesn't have it to give.
What about Europe?
Well, Europe is an area of multiple nations, each of which have their own interests, and who collaborate when it's in their interest to do so. It is surrounded by something called the European Union and NATO, which is supposed to contain them, but really it only contains them when they want to be there. So if the French want Europe to look a certain way, and the Germans want it a different way, the European Union is hardly going to hold them in power. What it does is hold smaller countries that are expecting payments or something from the European Union in power. And those countries that are engaged in war that might need financial help. So what I see here is a myth. It's a myth of Europe. Just as there was never anything, Germany and France and so on, 50 years ago, it's the same is true now.
What is American attitude and what is American position to the world, especially to this problem, Ukraine, but let's say Ukraine and relations to Russia?
First, remember something very important about the United States. It is the only major country in the world that cannot be invaded by land. It has Canada, it has Mexico, and neither can do it. Where we can be invaded is by sea. So for the United States, control of, say, the Pacific from the Chinese, this matters a great deal. For the Atlantic, too, it matters. So we have to understand that it is not a European country landlocked with neighbors real here. It is two things. A sea power, and secondly, a very rich country. In other words, that can afford the kind of navy that it has, but also afford to do business in the entire world. So it makes it more powerful than it appears because it is so safe in a way that Russia isn't and China isn't, so safe from attack, and has the wealth. Well, it's a very special country and behaves that way, thinks itself as very special.
But although the United States are so powerful, you wrote the book about approaching internal crisis in the United States.
Well, every country has crises. You have to remember that the United States is an invented country. It doesn't have an ideal framework in it, but it changes constantly. And as it changes, it creates tremendous stress and unhappiness. So in 1970, for example, we had the crisis of Vietnam, the crisis of the Arab oil embargo, the crisis of a president, Nixon, who was a criminal. All of these things were there. But the important thing to remember about that crisis is we overcame it readily. So what appears to be a crisis that might break another country doesn't break a country that is expecting crisis, is expecting itself to evolve. So we think about these countries, the United States has a flexibility that is built into the founding.
But how that crisis will appear and how will disappear?
It will appear and disappear depending on its need and certainty. So the United States does not have to be as careful as other countries. Because of its geographical position, its wealth and so on, it can afford mistakes that would wreck other countries. And it does make every mistake you can imagine. And yet the power remains. So we have to think about power in terms of its flexibility. So a country that does not have any flexibility, it has a certain power under this circumstance. The United States' advantage is that it's so highly flexible that it can not only survive crises, but it can create things that nobody could be thought could be afraid.
So you would not say that world order will collapse soon?
The world order may collapse, but not something important like the United States. And I mean that as a joke, but look, the world order is changing constantly. It is changing from First World War to Second World War, Second World War, Cold War. The idea that there's something sanctified about the world order is really very strange. The reality is that we are shifting now dramatically. One of the things that's shifting now is Russia's ability to defend itself against the West. Another thing is that China's performance is shifting. Many things are shifting, but the idea that there's some sort of sacred world order that we must respect is, well, what we're really saying is the way the world was when I was young must live forever.
How would be that war, Ukraine, Russia, could be, how could be ended, how it could be negotiated with Russia?
Well, first you have to understand why they went to war. Russia was very close to the Ukrainian border, 300 miles away. And for all of its history, it survived from NATO, it survived from Napoleon to Hitler by the distance they had to go to get to Moscow. It stopped it. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union, that distance had disappeared. And Russia had to, as I would think, extremely expand that distance. The problem was that if they expanded it so that all of Ukraine fell under it, it would now be at the border of NATO, with the NATO countries. And this the United States could not accept. So what you had was two very reasonable imperatives. The Americans didn't want the Russians on the border here, and the Russians didn't want the Ukrainians close to Moscow, and they went to war. In this war, no one is winning. The Ukrainians are not going to win the war, if you mean by that to overthrow the Russians. The Russians do not have the force in the past year and a half to break the Ukrainians, even come close to it. And the Americans, being very clever, are not involved in the war, but making sure that it goes on. So in this situation, this has to stop. It has to stop because it's really stupid. It can't keep fighting. So Russia is not going to get what it wanted, but you could offer Russia something. And what you could offer Russia is technological transfers from the United States that would allow Russia to build civilian products and become quite wealthy. Because the secret to everybody is, yes, they worry about Napoleon, but they really want to become well-to-do. They want their oligarchs to do beautifully, and the United States can give them that. The Russians will have to agree to take only a small part of Ukraine, maybe Donbass, and the Ukrainians will have to swallow the fact that they are not going to defeat the Russians, and they are going to hold on to most of their territory, but not all of it. Now, this is very difficult politically for every country to do. For Putin to admit that he failed, that to have the Ukrainians admit they failed, these are very hard things to do. But there is no other choice. This can't go on. The war is over. It's just that nobody knows how to stop it.
So, you followed during Yugoslav crisis, Balkan situation. How you would see now, regional perspective, because it was talking very much about membership to European Union. This is one part of the regional politics. The another part, which is important for us, is Kosovo issue. Now, we had a couple of days ago, for instance, a letter signed by Chancellor Scholz, the President Macron, and Prime Minister Meloni, calling Serbia to recognize de facto, they say, de facto Kosovo independence. But you know, that is very hard for us, almost impossible. Let's say what happened in Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh. Let's say what is going on now with Donbass and all that issues related to territorial integrity. Now, in United Nations, it was spoken, and the United States are the biggest defender of territorial unity and integrity. It's not atmosphere that we can say, okay, take 15% of our land.
Well, remember, talk is cheap. And they say things like this all the time, never expecting anything to come true. The more important question that was asked is not this question of Kosovo, which has to be put to bed somehow. The question is, how does the Balkans, how does Serbia, emerge as a significant economic power. When we look at Europe and we take a look at how well it's developed, we remember also they're not going to help you do that. They're not looking for competitors. But what has to happen is that this is a region with very educated people, capable people, people who've traveled the world, who know what to be sold and bought, okay? And the region finally has to start emphasizing the crucial question of economic growth in a world that's growing and taking advantage of it. I have no idea how to solve the crises that you have, but mostly you should go beyond them, because it's not going to go away, and people will continue to make speeches at the United Nations and forget that they made the speech. So the crucial thing for every country everywhere, focus on the center of gravity of your need. Then take your capable businessmen, your capable technologists, and so on, and turn them loose to make it happen. Now, I'm an American, so this is unfair to you because I'm doing what an American would do. But it's not a bad thing to look at, because the European Union, I think, is a failure, and the United States isn't. So you might want to focus it on the United States. But the key is use your talent to make money. That is the foundation of your safety.
And, let's go to United States again. Now, next year will be presidential elections, and it seems that two rivals, old rivals, former President Trump and President Biden will emerge as the candidates. How do you see that process and that rivalry between them and what will be the outcome?
First, it's very important to understand that a president is not that important. He has a position, he makes speeches, he makes decisions. Maybe somebody follows it, maybe not. In other words, the presidency is a symbol of the country, and that's important. But the idea that he will turn the United States this way or that way, well, you saw with Trump the catastrophic attempts he made and the outcome. I think at this point, Biden is not going to run for president. I don't think that his own party wants to see him there. I think Trump has an excellent chance of being in jail, and he can be president from there. Maybe we'd love to see that. But we have to remember that the United States, according to my model, right now is making a massive shift in the way it behaves. It seems like an unbearable crisis, but there are a lot of people out there who have very different views. But again, remember, this is not a dictatorship. The president will not make all the decisions, or even most of them. He will try to get by. And if you focus on the condition of the president in trying to understand the United States, you're going to get it wrong. It's very different.
And on that, we know you as a Stratford chairman, but what are you doing now, and what is your company now?
Well, my company is Geopolitical Futures. It is Stratford, but for various called it business reasons, it was not wise to continue in that mode. We've been in this business now for almost 10 years doing this, but our goal is very simple. It is to explain to the world what is happening without being motivated by any beliefs. So it's a large room of people filled with lack of belief, trying to understand the world. And that's a pretty good way to do it.